morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to our 5th Wellness Series. We'll start our session with our land acknowledgement, so I invite you to read the words in bold with me as you're comfortable. The Creator, overflowing with love, breathed all of creation into being.
God made people to care for the earth, God's creatures, and each other.
We acknowledge that the land on which we live, work, and worship today is the land traditionally cared for by the Anishinaabe, Ottawandaran, Haudenosaunee, and Métis peoples.
When our ancestors came, they imposed practices of land ownership that led to broken relationships.
We acknowledge that the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge, laws, and philosophies of Indigenous peoples with whom we share this land today.
We long for reconciliation with our Indigenous siblings so that together we can care for creation and share the land that brings resources as the Creator intended.
I'm here to welcome Courtney from Leobifit. I'm very excited to have her with us to talk about food myths and misconceptions. In part because I have a mother who gets sucked into every one of those videos on the internet that tells you what you should and shouldn't eat, and I'm excited for a trusted source to tell us some good information about how to eat healthy. But I also just very impressed with Courtney's business model. I first heard about Leobifit just a couple of years before the pandemic because one of my friends was working for her, and he spoke very highly about what an inclusive and welcoming work environment it was. And then during the pandemic, they moved to virtual classes, and now she's running an online business, and I was very excited to see how inclusive her business model is of making sure that she can give fitness to everybody and making sure that the goal is about being healthy and loving your body the way it is. So thank you for being with us this morning, Courtney.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone in Zoom land. Okay, so I wanted to introduce myself. So thank you so much for having me, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to speak, Lisa. So I am both an ACE certified group fitness instructor. So I've been teaching now for about 10 years. And I'm also a body image and mindful eating coach, which I'll kind of dive into what mindful eating is as part of the kind of approach to today's topic. And yes, I'm the founder of Loyobo, which stands for Love Your Body. We're now an online wellness community that really is focusing on how to generate health and embrace movement from an approach of self-care and loving your body rather than focusing on weight or trying to make yourself smaller or really trying to change your body aesthetically. So today we're going to be talking about food labels, myths, and misconceptions, which is a big one. There's so much confusing information out there. And yes, so many videos and different sources telling you this is a great food, this is a superfood, never eat this, eat tons of this. So it can be hard to wade through all of that information. And we're going to be looking at this from a mindful eating and gentle nutrition approach. So I'm going to explain really what that is and how you can use this approach to heal your relationship with food and understand your food choices. We're going to talk about common labels, especially from a Canadian context, the science behind them, the current regulations behind them, and how you can use that information to decipher what is most relevant to you. And that includes talking about things like ingredients, best before dates, and how to make the most of that information. So I wanted to start off with what is mindful eating and gentle nutrition. And I wanted to kind of check in. Does anybody have any idea of what these terms mean? Or are they more new to everybody?
Looks like new to everybody.
All right, sounds good. So mindful eating is also known as intuitive eating. And it's an approach that's all about learning how to understand your body, how to understand what your body needs, how to remove morality and judgment around food. And it's about removing food rules so that you can ditch and ditch this idea of diet mentality and living your life by a strict diet. It's about slowing down. It's about learning how to listen to your internal cues of hunger, of satiety, and while you're also using external cues to help you build that awareness. The goal is really with mindful eating is to kind of turn off the autopilot and any of the kind of knee-jerk harmful behavior, which can include rules around food that you learned growing up and eating, making food choices out of habit or out of emotion rather than a physical need, ignoring sensations in your body or ignoring your body's needs, trying to push through or override them. It's about really being mindful and using self-love to guide your choices and feelings around food and nourishing your body. There is a large body of science around mindful eating and the intuitive eating approach, including, for example, a 2006 study of 1,300 college women, which found that intuitive eaters had higher levels of body satisfaction. They were able to reject the thin is ideal mentality and were able to experience higher levels of self-esteem, satisfaction with life, optimism, and proactive coping. In addition to, the research shows that mindful eating is a solution to binge eating, disordered eating, as well as eating disorders, as well as a lot of common physical ailments and diseases like diabetes, high blood pressure, and heart disease. But most importantly, as many of us can attest, diets are really hard to follow and they're not a sustainable solution. Many of us, I'm sure myself included, I have a long history of failed diets and trying to stick to certain approaches to food that just haven't worked. Mindful eating is the only one that I've had any sort of consistency with over the last 10 years, and that my clients also can vouch for the same thing, as well as the research, that it is a sustainable approach to eating, and it feels empowering and encourage you to enjoy food, which I love. So I wanted to then shift, what does this mean when it comes to nutrition? So in mindful eating, there is a place for nutrition, but most importantly, not if nutrition makes you feel like crap. Sorry, a cat has apparently joined the workshop today. This is Sloan, everybody. Not if it makes you feel like crap. Nutrition shouldn't make you feel stressed, and it shouldn't trigger any behaviors that resemble a dieting or disordered eating approach to food. So nutrition, we really are trying to avoid using it as another weapon against our body that we use to punish it, that we use to shame ourselves, or that we use to restrict access to food. So when we think of gentle nutrition and this approach that mindful eating uses, it's about understanding your body's needs, as I said, and then different nutritional benefits that food may provide, with a lens really focused on self-care and writing our own rules. It's really focused on what foods we can add in to what we eat rather than which foods to avoid. And it is about creating food rules. Sorry, it's not about creating food rules or labels around which food is good or which food is bad. It's simply another tool to understand your body's needs and how to feel your best. It's also a constant process of self-discovery and recognizing the kind of limitations of nutritional science. It's really about asking questions, getting curious, and not accepting certain information that you're given as absolute truths. So in the beginning, I really emphasize that the first most important thing is learning how to tune inwards. So if you're thinking about learning more about mindful eating, which I'd be more than happy to chat more about, or I have other resources if you want more information, the first goal is starting to learn how to pay attention to your body, starting to tune inward, to listen to those cues, to understand what hunger feels like, to understand what fullness and food satisfaction feels like. And then once we feel comfortable, we can start adding in learning about some gentle nutrition. And that step, that kind of order is really crucial to help you clear out the noise, to be able to listen to your body, and to really feel comfortable giving yourself unconditional permission to enjoy your food. And once that connection is stronger, then you feel ready to be able to incorporate or explore aspects of nutritional science based on your own judgment of what feels good and what works for your body. So the most important thing, again, is asking questions. We'll do that together as I go through some of the common food labels of really not taking nutritional information as absolute truth, understanding the weight stigma, the science, and the commercial aspect to the information that we're given, and how they influence the way our society sees certain food. So a big part of today's workshop, I hope you take away with, I want you to give yourself permission to ignore food labels and to not necessarily even think about nutritional science if it's something that really interferes with your relationship with food. So really having that self-empowerment. So we're going to start talking about some of the common food labels, or aspects of food labels and what they mean and where they come from and what the current regulations are in Canada. So we're going to start with the most basic one, and this is serving size. This is one that I think is extremely on the side of something to ignore. And I'll explain why. So serving sizes, you'll often find it right underneath that big bold nutrition facts label. And it'll either say a combination of how many servings there are in a container, and what the serving size is as far as number of items. So for example, if you're thinking about a bag of cookies, it'll say like the number of cookies that are in a serving size, or it'll say a measurement, like a weight, or like here you see in this example, the 2/3 of a cup, 55 grams. So the biggest takeaway with the serving size is the serving size does not, and this is the big myth, it does not equal portion size or nutritional recommendations about what you should eat. And I think that's what many of us judge, right? Is like if the serving size says a serving size is only 5 chips, that's all I should have is the 5 chips. And anything above that means I've overindulged, I've had too much, I've gone past my portion size. So there has been a change since 2022 in Canada. The government has introduced regulations to make serving sizes more realistic. And companies have had to acknowledge that they need to be more standardized and closer to what people actually eat rather than kind of arbitrary sizes. I always like to joke, for example, you know, those like little ice cream containers, like the Ben and Jerry's or the Haagen-Dazs, those would often say that they're like 5 portions or 5 servings. And we all know that nobody eats those in 5 portions. So they have gotten a lot better. They have become a little bit more realistic, a little bit more in line with how we actually eat. But that's really important to take into consideration, is that it's in the company's advantage to manipulate serving sizes to be smaller than what people would actually eat, because it makes the numbers more appealing. So for example, from a diet culture perspective, it makes you feel like you should be eating less. It makes a lot of the other statistics that are on the food labels, which we'll go into in a moment, like the calories, like the fat percentage, like the sodium percentage. When you're talking about a smaller size food, it's always going to be lots of other smaller numbers. So it makes the food look more appealing when they make smaller serving sizes. So this is one of those things. The serving size is not based on nutritional science necessarily. So the new requirements, as I said, just started in 2022. So this has gotten a lot better, but they're still arbitrary. There is no one serving size fits all. So when it comes to thinking about what's your serving size, you may take this as an initial guideline, but again, really giving yourself permission of how much of this particular food makes me feel satisfied, how much makes me feel like I've eaten enough and I've nourished my body. Especially because there are differences in men and women, there are differences in ages, there are differences in lifestyle and activity levels. So that's the first one. Serving size is recognizing that it is not based on the recommended nutritional portion size. Now, these ones are big ones. These are all the health claims and the health symbols. So some of the most common ones in Canada that we know of, the Sensible Solution, the green one in the middle, that is the one by Kraft. So you'll see that on a lot of Kraft products. The health check by the Smart and Stroke Heart and Stroke Foundation is another really common one that we'll see. Restaurants will often have a little like heart check or some sort of, they're usually green, some sort of little green symbol in their menus as far as which menu items they're trying to highlight as the healthier option, or some of these other labels that say things like gluten-free or low in fat or fat-free or whole grain, non-GMO, things like that. You'll see a lot of them. And while Health Canada does require these kind of health labels to be based on what they dub as scientific fact, they also specify that broad healthy for you claims or healthy choice claims, as well as symbols, logos, and specific words are allowed. So we don't necessarily, when we see these symbols, they're once again arbitrary as far as we don't know how they're judging the food. We don't know what criteria they're using. And often these symbols are not developed by the government or any kind of not-for-profit agency. They're often very much created by the brands themselves. They're very much created by the commercial entities, third parties, corporations that are receiving their funding from the brands. So while it is required that the information be truthful and not misleading, it's recommended, even Health Canada says that they shouldn't necessarily, consumers shouldn't necessarily rely on general health claims to make informed food choices. These health claims are optional. They're not at all required by the government or regulated by the government in that way, that certain foods have to have them and don't. And they only really highlight a few key nutrients or foods. And something that's really important to remember as far as food science goes, things like the sensible solution or the smart choices, is that, again, they're only giving you a picture, a small part of the picture of information. So when it says, for example, the sensible solution one, when it says something like low sodium, low calories, 0 grams of carbs, when we remove something from food, especially highly processed foods, it usually impacts the taste, right? We've all had, for example, you can taste the difference between like a sugar-free candy versus the normal sugar amount candy. So in order to make foods still palatable, still taste good, still sell well, they usually, if they're taking out all of the sodium, if they're taking out all of the sugar, if they're taking out all of the carbs, they're going to have to replace them with something else. And that's where we see things like artificial sweeteners come in, or different kinds of ingredients that replace them. So they are kind of doing one thing with the left hand while doing something else with the right. So that's where, again, it's not saying that these are bad information. It's just saying that this is not necessarily how we have to make our choices. If we're comparing two products, one has a little green check mark and the other doesn't, it doesn't necessarily mean that the food with the green check mark is the better food, is the healthier food, is the best food option. There are so many other factors that we can use when making those decisions. And especially when groceries are so expensive nowadays, it's not necessarily worth more to pay more for something like the food with the green check mark or the healthy food label. So a lot of the common claims and words that you'll see in these sort of health labels is light, or and that's LIGHT or LITE. And a little bit of information as far as what Health Canada requires these words to mean. So the word light, it just means that the food is either processed or modified so that it contains at least 25% less of the nutrient when compared with a similar product. So this could be, you'll often see this lower sodium version of the exact same product. But again, there's no rules as far as which product it needs to be compared to. So that means it could be being compared to another brand, not necessarily the exact same product. You'll often see things like fat-free, free of fat, no fat, 0 fat, without fat, contains no fat. And that means that there's less than 0.5 grams of fat per reference amount and per the serving size that's stated on the label. So again, we've already talked about that. It means that these labels of fat-free or whatever can be misleading because they're going back to that baseline reference that is arbitrary. And then you'll see other words like reduced, less, lower in, fewer. And again, that comes back to what Health Canada requires, is that the food is processed or modified so that it contains at least 25% less of the nutrient when compared with a similar product. So again, there's some rules and regulations behind these labels, but there's still a lot of room for manipulation, a lot of room for companies to make these health checks work in their favor. So the next one is nutrition facts. So these are the percentages that you see on the food label, the percentages of daily values, and usually the gram amounts or milligram amounts next to them. So for example, in this label that I have up here on the screen, we see that it has like 0% fat, 0% fiber, 22% of the daily value of sugars, 10% potassium, and so on and so forth. So the most important thing to remember with these daily values is it is the same across the board. So in Canada, the requirement for these labels is that the daily value is based on a 2,000 calorie per day diet. So that's the idea, is if you are eating a 2,000 calorie a day diet, this particular item will be 22% of the sugars based on that specific numerical diet. This 2,000 calorie per day diet is once again one of those things that is not universal to everyone. Most often, 2,000 calories is actually quite low as far as most of our nutritional needs and what we need to nourish our bodies to get through the day, to make sure that we're eating enough food. If you have any activity in your life at all, meaning if you go on walks with your dogs, if you like your local Zumba class, if you lift any sort of weights, 2,000 calories will likely not be enough to make you feel full and energized. So when we're thinking about these percentages, that's really the most important thing to remember, is that they're creating a one-size-fits-all percentage that may not reflect what you need and what your body needs and what's going to make you feel your best. So with the newer regulations, they do provide this little disclaimer that's on the bottom. They now also explain the percentages a little bit. 5% or less is a little, 15% or more is a lot. So that gives a little bit more guidelines that will help you understand where the percentages are. But the most important kind of nutritional ingredients that will provide you with a little bit of information that's on the back that you can look to as far as seeking more of. As we talked about mindful eating, we want to add more things into our diet that will help us feel good. Great ones to check out that isn't on this specific label. It's just shown as fibers, but sometimes they'll also be shown as dietary fiber. So fiber is an indigestible part of plant foods. So it is great for digestion and gut health. So when you have a higher gram amount, when you have a higher percentage of fiber, those are foods that can help get things moving, especially if you have digestive issues. They can help make things more regular and often, for many of us, make our bodies feel good. Vitamin D. So this will usually be listed kind of towards the bottom where we have those ingredients like the potassium and the calcium and the iron. Vitamin D, we live in Canada. That means many of us are deficient in vitamin D. So any product that has more vitamin D will often be a welcome addition to your body, and it helps with both mood as well as bone development. Calcium, the one that you see there on the screen, a mineral most often associated with healthy bones and teeth. So that's a great one to look for higher percentages of. Iron, another great one that we're often all low of, an important mineral that helps maintain healthy blood. Potassium, the other one he's seen on screen here, an essential mineral that's needed by all tissues in the body. So even this one having 10% potassium, that shows that there's some food in there that will help, some minerals that will help your body feel its best. Or protein. So this one, it won't give percentage of protein ever, because there is no one size fits all recommended protein amount. So this will be something that you can work with a nutritionist, or just start to notice how much protein in a day, again, makes you feel your best, makes you feel energized, makes you feel less sore, makes you feel in a better mood. So generally, the more protein that's in something, the more that it will have that satisfaction factor. So it'll make us feel fuller for longer. All righty. So ingredient lists, and I'm sorry, these ones, when they're blown up, the pictures are not as clear as I was hoping they would be. Ingredient lists. So there's a lot of ingredients that are, looking at the ingredient list can be very intimidating. There's a lot of big scientific names that can be on there. We're not necessarily sure even what we're looking at some of the times. So I just wanted to share a few little bits of information that can be helpful for deciphering ingredient lists. So the first is that the ingredients are listed on products in descending order by weight. So meaning that the first ingredient listed is always present in the largest amount. And that can be useful when you're comparing products. When you're looking at two different products, maybe that when you're doing that price comparison, doing that, okay, one's on sale, one's not, which one is the better value? That's something that we can take into consideration. So for example, on the left-hand side where we have that green label, we can see that in this example ingredient list, the first ingredient is sugars. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sugar is not a bad thing. It's what our body depends on. It's an easily available energy source. But at the same time, I know for someone like myself, I have a really sensitive blood sugar level. So if I'm eating a high sugar product, it may cause my blood sugar to spike. It may just not make me feel the best. So, and if I'm looking for something that's going to satisfy me, maybe I want something that's higher in protein. So I might look at something like the yogurt on the right-hand side where the first ingredient is whole milk. So that's going to have a higher level of protein rather than the first ingredient being sugars. Fats, sugars, and salt may be listed under several different names. The new regulation does require them to group together sugars, which is a change on the label, which is why you'll see things like, again, that example on the left, it says sugars, and then in brackets, it has the different ingredients that make up that sugar component, because they were hiding sugars. If it said sugar in one place, they could have 4 or 5 different ingredients that also contribute to the sugars, but because they're lower in weight, they could appear further down the list. Now they all have to be grouped together. So that's really, really helpful. And when we think about the other misconception is that scientific sounding names are bad in ingredient labels. Often I used to fall prey to this misconception as well, that like if you can't pronounce things on the ingredient list, that means they're inherently bad, or they're not as good as if there's something that you can pronounce. And that's really not necessarily true. There are a lot of very innocent ingredients that get added to food, both to help with preservation so that they have a longer shelf life. There can be scientific names for normal everyday ingredients, but they're just put in the scientific phrasing for whatever reason on the label. So for example, like sugar may appear as terms that like brown sugar, molasses, agave nectar, but it may also have things like glucose, fructose, maltose, galactose somewhere in there as well. And that doesn't change the morality of it, again, or how good it is or how bad it is for your body. It's just using different terminology. Things like sodium will show up as salt, brine, baking soda, monosodium glutamate, and sodium benzoate. So again, not necessarily a bad thing, just different names for the same product. Fat might show up as lard, partially hydrogenated or hydrogenated oils, tallow, and shortening. So again, not necessarily something that has to stress you out. It's a great way to ask questions, to find out more information, and to just, again, I start to identify foods that maybe understanding why different foods make you feel different ways, of like looking at the ingredients to say, okay, what's in this that maybe isn't in something that makes me feel better. Another one, for example, another good example is that ascorbic acid is just vitamin C. So That's another like super fancy scientific name that's really just for a very common ingredient. So I like my personal stance is I like to be aware of what's in my food so that I can make conscious choices. Even, for example, as I mentioned, when I'm managing my budget, I want to know what I'm paying for so that I'm going to look for things that have maybe cheaper prices, but higher protein and higher fiber so that they will give me more bang for my buck. But I really try not to stress about it too much because again, it's more about how my body feels, how my body reacts to certain types of food, rather than demonizing or creating a hierarchy of ingredient list. Best before dates. This is a really important one to cover because, again, because of food prices right now and wanting to, be good for the environment and reduce food waste. The best before date indicates how long food will remain of good quality that's guaranteed by the company. So it doesn't necessarily mean that food is bad after that date. It doesn't mean that food is not safe to eat after that date. I like to use the smell, look, taste test. If it says it's best before and the date has already passed, use your best judgment, the smell, look, taste test. There's a very high likelihood that it doesn't mean that the food is bad. And often these best before dates as well refer to when the food is, once the food is opened. So if it's unopened, best before doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go bad that quickly. So again, the best before dates, we don't have to take it as holy grail. We can use our best judgment to avoid food waste and make our own decisions about food. So these are the most common food labels that I think cause people stress, that I wanted to show a different perspective from a mindful eating and gentle nutrition approach. And I wanted to include lots of time for questions. I wanted to open it up for questions and discussion and thoughts, and even just you sharing what stresses you out about food labels that you maybe wanted to know more about.
Courtney, I was just wondering with the best before date, is there criteria for the companies to put those dates on? Do they have any guidelines around it?
The short answer is no. So there's no standardization as far as Health Canada says, as far as they don't have a document that says, okay, for chips, based on manufacturing date, this is how long a chip stays good for in the bag, because each company's packaging is different, how they preserve their products are different. So it's really up to the individual companies. That's why I said the best before date is really when the company can feel good guaranteeing its food, which if you think about, again, what's in their best interest? Their best interest is that you throw out the food and buy more. So they're going to always err on the side of a shorter best before date period. So that's also something to keep in mind. I like to always ask myself who's profiting, who's profiting off of this information. And I always want to make sure it's me at the end of the day. So who's profiting is if I get to keep more of my grocery budget, if I get to make sure that I'm not throwing out my food, that's going to be the best approach. So yeah, unfortunately, there's no standardization.
Thanks.
The only thing I will back up, the only thing that there is standardization for is medication. So if there's an expiry date on like natural health food products or supplements, that's in a different category than just food. And that's a little bit of a whole nother conversation. But for food products, best before, no standardization.
Thanks.
I recently saw a show talking about packaged on date. And sometimes they've caught places taking like hamburger and repackaging and saying, well, it was packaged on Monday, even though originally it was packaged before that. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, that's a great, I feel like that's an excellent segue question from what I just said, which is who profits off of it. So there's a lot of, what's the word that I'm going to use? I think it's going to be that misleading. There's a lot of loopholes that especially grocery stores can tap into when it comes to product claims, and not just grocery stores, food manufacturers as well. So even that word packaged in, That's where, for example, many of us would prefer to support local Canadian companies, right? And products that are made in Canada. There's a big difference between a product that's fully manufactured in Canada and grown in Canada versus packaged in Canada, but they can get away with that word, maybe the packaged by being smaller and the word Canada being much bigger. So when it comes to grocery store items, and what I'm clarifying as grocery store items are ones that are like prepared and packaged in the store itself. Yes, it is common that, for example, food that comes frozen that then, so I'm thinking, for example, like fish and some meats where it's frozen and then the grocery store is the one that thaws it. That can affect the packaged on dates. And I would say with this, looking for clarity on those labels and those dates, the best thing to do is literally ask questions. So get to know your grocery stores, ask questions of the staff. They'll usually, for example, in the meat section, they'll have a butcher on staff. They'll have someone who's in charge of that department. It's a great way to just not necessarily from an angry, hey, I'm trying to do one of those gotcha moments, but just ask them honestly and say, I'm looking to make the best choices I can when it comes to which products to buy. I love supporting your store. Can you provide me with a little bit of insight of how your specific store handles, the dates or the stickers or whatever label you're looking for more information on? Because that is, once again, not super standardized. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I don't need that, I'm just. No, you don't need it for you, you need it for the rest of us.
All right. I was just wondering, what the expiry date on things, does the product lose any nutritional value?
Oh, good question. I will put a little disclaimer on this and say I'm not a nutritionist, so I don't have necessarily the same scientific education and background as someone who has a nutrition degree. I would say for the most part, no. Because when you're thinking, especially when you're thinking of best before, and again, this is different than nutritional supplements or medications. The answer there is yes. Usually that's what an expiry date means, is that it's at its high, they can guarantee highest potency kind of up until that point, and then the medication or supplement loses its effectiveness. With food, however, we're generally not talking about a change in the food state or molecular makeup. So I'll give an example of a chip. The actual makeup of that chip doesn't change during that best before. It's just going to be its quality as far as like taste and texture and maybe enjoyment is not necessarily going to be as high. You'll notice those changes, but the actual structure of the food doesn't change and wouldn't necessarily change the nutritional value itself.
All righty, thank you.
Hi, I wonder if you could discuss grains. I find it really frustrating to analyze labels, whole grain, 12% whole wheat, and it's confusing. And just if you can go over, how to analyze that and what's the happiest.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think this is definitely something where when it comes to, I'm going to expand it, not just grains, but any wheat products in general, there has been a ton of confusing science and confusing marketing around good and bad wheat, good and bad grains. So especially with the kind of the rise in popularity of the gluten-free phenomenon, which I will state very openly, gluten is not a super common allergen. If you have something like celiac disease or Crohn's disease, then yes, gluten is something that is not going to make your body feel good and something that you're probably not going to want to include in your regular eating choices. For most of us, when we think of grains or when we think of wheat, how I like to break things down is carbohydrates, once again, very easy available source of energy for our body, something that gets quickly digested, something that our body often loves, especially if we're having like a high activity day. We want those easily available, quick sources of energy. When it comes to the grains themselves, we're not talking about huge nutritional differences. All right. I kind of look at this as like it's a little bit of splitting hairs. And we can think of, yes, there are some studies that show that the more, what's the word that I'm looking for? Whole food and plant-based food, meaning that food that doesn't necessarily go through a ton of processing. And when I say a ton of processing, it doesn't mean that processed food is bad. It means that the closer we eat food to its natural source can have some benefits. That being said, what's most important is using your body as the guide. So I like to pay attention to, okay, if I'm choosing this particular grain, if I'm choosing this particular bread, how does it make my body feel? In a couple of different caveats. So number one, and what am I looking for out of the bread? Do I want, so for me, most of the time, taste is up there. I want it to taste yummy. I want it to taste delicious. Second is kind of long lasting fullness. I want it to be something that when I eat it, I'm going to feel really satisfied. I'm going to feel really full for a good chunk of time. And I want it to be maybe something that has some other nutritional value. So not just necessarily the grain itself, but the bread product as a whole. So is it hot? Is it super high in sugar without a lot of other stuff that's inside? Or can I look for things that have maybe higher levels of protein, higher levels of fiber, higher levels of maybe some added calcium, things like that. So that's what I would think of those two things. So think of the bread product or the wheat product as a whole. So rather than focusing on the grain itself, so, because for example, like that whole grain label I said, that whole grain label could be on a box of kids cereal, right? But when we look at that whole grain, yes, it might have whole grain. What's the kind of the makeup of the product itself? So those cereals are going to be higher in sugar. They're not going to have as many of the other nutrients. So what that signals to me is I say, okay, that's going to be a product that may taste really, really good and have that joy factor in play, which has a place in my diet. At the same time, it's probably not going to have me very full for very long. So I'm going to eat that bowl of cereal. It's going to taste great. And then I'm going to be hungry again in like 45 minutes or an hour. So that's not going to be a choice that I want to make unless I'm looking for that joy factor. If I'm looking for that nutrient, that nourishing, I want to fuel my body, I'm going to pick something different. So I would say that's the two factors is look at the product as a whole and think about how it makes you feel and what you're looking for out of that product. Does that make sense? Yeah, and don't stress. I always like to add in the caveat that like one meal, one food will not make or break your health. There's a lot of marketing around that, like the superfoods, right? Is like if you eat this food, you'll live till 100, you'll cure all the things. And if you eat this food, it'll instantly cause you all the terrible diseases. It's just not true. Most of the time, those scientific studies, we're not eating things at quantities high enough that it would have really either negative or positive impacts. And that's why they say things like variety is best. Also, keep in mind that stress is a health impact, right? So whatever marginal benefit you might be getting from figuring out what is the, from a nutrition science, best, most nutritionally dense food to choose, if you're stressing out about it, that's going to cancel each other out. That stress is going to raise your cortisol. It's going to impact your hormones. It's going to increase inflammation in your body. So the best thing is letting yourself feel good, letting yourself relax, not taking it too seriously, and that will be the best for your health.
So enjoying that piece of white bread is just fine.
Exactly. And that's why I say there's room for play foods. Like life would be so boring. I can say as somebody who used to be in an incredibly small body with a very restrictive diet, life was not super fun. Life was very stressful. And I would have to like plan ahead for social situations. I couldn't participate in family celebrations. We want to see health as part of that enjoyment factor. There's a really interesting study that they did and concept now that's known as the French paradox. So France, we know, right, loves their food, loves their breads, loves their wine, loves their cheeses, loves their meats. And yet they have as a country, they have lower rates of heart disease. And so the research were like, well, what's going on? They eat so many of the foods that are demonized in North America. And it came down to that enjoyment factor that the French not only eat these foods, but really enjoy it and they savor it and they make those meals an experience. And that's part of health as well. Us enjoying ourselves, us being present in the moment, us reducing stress, being more mindful. So that's also something important to consider when we think of what's going to make me feel my best, what's going to impact my health in the most positive way.
Well, I am one of the stressors. I'm buying food thinking of my husband who shouldn't have over amounts of sugar or salt. So normally, a lot of the products that are low in sugar are high in salt.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do?
Yeah, it's a frustrating situation, right? Especially when we are thinking about managing health concerns, managing different conditions that we may have, managing advice from the doctors. And that's where, again, I want to empower you with the idea that one meal will not make or break health. One ingredient, one food item will not make or break health. And when we think of what can we add in? So if we're trying to cut down on sugar, if we're identifying that that doesn't make us feel good, then we can focus on, okay, what else can I add into my food that will increase the enjoyment or increase the flavor? When it comes to sugar, we can ask the same thing. So if there are this might be helpful for me to explain to you is like, are there certain foods that you're often coming up against with that back and forth decision?
No, it's just that all the cans that I'm checking, or all the desserts, or all the, yeah, he likes desserts, and there's so much.
Listen, because desserts are amazing. So here's a couple different things that I'm going to say. So number one, this is where it's important to recognize that the ingredient itself doesn't have moral value. Oh, all of a sudden I'm getting an echo. I don't know if you guys are getting an echo. No, okay. I'm going to try to ignore it then because I'm just hearing it of my own voice. So salt in and of itself is not a bad thing, right? Salt is necessary to life. We all need salt in order to function. So salt, when it comes to canned goods, is part of the preservative. So that's something important to remember is that there won't be food, especially in cans, that has zero salt. So we want to think of it in context of things like that, is just because there's salt present doesn't necessarily make it a bad food. And when we think of this goal again, as we want husband to feel his best, we want him to feel healthy, we want him to listen to what his body needs. The more intensely that we focus on avoiding or restricting a specific food group, it's really important to recognize the psychology of how our minds actually work. Meaning that we've all been teenagers once upon a time, right? We've all been kids once upon a time. You've been there where as soon as somebody says you can't have something, now you want it 10 times more. Right? It's that idea of don't touch the stove. Well, now I kind of want to touch the stove. So it's important to think about that part of the way that, and it feels really backwards to start, but it's where understanding and accepting our physiology and the way that our minds work and the way that our bodies work will help us get closer to the goal. So in this case, the more we demonize and make the sugar and salt really, really bad, the more stress it's going to cause us, and the more those taboo food items are going to be all we think about. And they're going to be all that husband wants. And he's going to start. This is where, when we talk about disordered eating behavior, if we're hiding food, if we're sneaking food, if we feel like, It's called often the Last Supper effect or food scarcity, which is where, let's say I'm not allowed to have sugar at home. If I go to a party, if I go to a friend's house, if there's sweets at the church gathering, then I'm going to be more likely to be like, oh my God, I need to eat all the things now. So in this case, we can identify, let's have a conversation with husband and say, what are some foods that you like really enjoy, that bring you enjoyment, that make your body feel good? And that's key, that make your body feel good. Because I can say, I love cookies. Eating an entire box of cookies generally doesn't make my body feel good. So if I know having 2 or 3 cookies on a daily basis makes me feel amazing, it gets me my joy, it makes me feel good, I don't feel deprived in my life, I don't stress, then it can be an incredibly powerful thing to give myself permission to have the cookies, to have them in the house every shopping trip, to make sure that they're on the list, because that is going to make them less obsessive, less taboo, less tempting. The more that I just say, this is part of it, I'm going to allow myself to have it. And I know the fears, especially if you're new to this approach, it's this idea of if I give myself unconditional permission to eat the thing, I'm going to eat all of the thing all the time, right? If I'm just allowed, if Courtney is saying that there are room for donuts and cookies and ice cream in a healthy diet, then that's all I'm going to eat. And there is sometimes a little pendulum effect where if we're way over here on sugar, salt, all these things are bad, I can't have any of it. As soon as I give myself permission, yeah, maybe for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, I'll swing to the other side where I'm eating more than feels good in my body. But there's this process of habitualization where the more that we're exposed to something, the less exciting it is, the less taboo, the less ooh it is. So it's going to feel really normal, and it's going to feel like, yeah, it's just part of life. And I've gotten to the point, and many of my clients have gotten to the point as well, where I forget that there is stuff in the cupboard. I normalize things so much that I'll go through the cupboard and be like, oh, look at all these chocolate bars that are back here. And it's not because, and there's no stress because I'm like, oh, they're there. I could eat them if I want, but I don't want them right now. So that's okay. They can live there, and there doesn't feel this out of control desire to eat them. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I know that that's not necessarily the easy answer that I know you want to hear of, like, okay, here's the magic way to pick food. It requires a little bit more internal work, but it's what is going to get you the results of not feeling so stressed and not feeling so frustrated. And hopefully, ideally as well, is having husband feel his best too.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Does anyone else have any other questions?
So one thing to add about when you talked about salt being a preservative, looking for frozen foods instead of canned foods might make a big difference because then freezing is a preservative. That was just now I also have a question. So we talked about like foods that make you feel good and make you feel satisfied. You can look at our family and know that that's been a struggle for many generations. And so as we're looking to how to feed the children in our family, we're trying to develop healthier habits. And I think part of it, is how do you help a small body, especially, differentiate between those foods that give you joy and make you feel emotionally good, and those foods that feel good in your body?
Great question. So the important thing to recognize, number one, is that both have value, right? Is that food, even when we think of our society and our culture, it has value beyond nutrition, right? A birthday cake, celebrating your birthday, doesn't really matter how much nutrition in there because that's about celebrating that person. It's about having that moment. It's about having everyone sing. And food does have value as well, as far as providing comfort, providing nostalgia, memories, traditions, social connections. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about that those are all health benefits, right? When we have that joy, when we have that, humans are very much social beings. Those are all things that make us healthier, that make us feel better. So we want to make sure that we're also communicating that with our children and our small people of like, that's part of how we think about what makes our body feel good. The best thing you can do is get out of your child's way. So if you've ever seen a baby, this is the most clear cut is we are all born intuitive eaters. It's the other noise as we grow up that gets in the way of this skill. So if you present a baby, and I'm going to say like baby, like not toddler once they've already had the influence, but like small baby, if you put a whole bunch of foods in front of this child that are equal parts the traditional like bad food, junk food, and traditional like good healthy food, like I'm thinking like on one side you put broccoli and the other side you put like bits of chocolate, the child is going to choose and eat them it's going to eat them both, probably in either equal amounts, or they might do things that surprise you as the adult with all these food rules of they may actually not touch the dessert, the junk food at all. They may just eat the broccoli or the fruit or whatever is in front of them because they're just listening to their bodies. They're listening to what feels good. The more that we take our food rules, our disordered eating habits, and try to apply those to the children, the more that they're going to take those on with them. So the best thing that you can do is, for example, normalizing the presence of what we may think of as joyful or play foods. That's one label to put on them. I try to really avoid labels and just think of like all food is joyful and good food. So what this can look like as far as like real actions, serving dessert at the same time as the meal and giving them the opportunity that if they want to eat the cupcake first, let them eat the cupcake first. And believe me, I know there's probably parts of you that are going, bah, but they're going to not get any nutrition. We want to let them guide the way and get them to encourage them to ask questions and tune inward. So you can say things like, how did eating that cupcake first make you feel? If they're still hungry later, that's a great opportunity to think, okay, what information is our body giving us? We really liked that cupcake, but it seems like our body really wanted other things too. That's not creating those good or bad labels. It's saying, okay, what did we learn about the cupcake? The cupcake isn't bad. It maybe just didn't have what we needed in that moment. And allowing them that process of self-discovery and trusting, once again, trusting in the long-term journey that one meal, one snack will not make or break their health. That's our anxiety and our fears that we're going to superimpose on them. The more that we can get out of their way, the more that we can empower them with information like I'm sharing with you today, empowering them the ability to ask questions, to be their own best judge of what works for their body. That's going to help them heal their relationship with food. And having open conversations like this, like having open conversations about this is food once, age appropriate. Once this is what food marketing looks like. This is what diet culture is. This is what, thin privilege is. And I also want to say, recognizing that it sounds like a lot of that weight stigma is still present. Maybe doing the work to let go of like, it's okay that our family is in bigger bodies. That's not a bad thing. That's not a failing of our family. That's part of our genetic makeup. That's part of who we are. And that's not inherently a bad thing or a moral failing on our part. Does that make sense?
That's great, thanks.
Welcome. And I know this is easier said than done. So know that it's a process. The fact that you're having these conversations mean that these are all conversations that I know were not happening when I was little. So the fact that we're having them, the fact that we're understanding that these are things that we need to take into consideration when we're thinking about raising our children already is a huge win. And so don't aim for perfection, aim for honesty, aim for trust, and aim for conversation.
I just have one thing I want to share with you and everybody here. A friend of mine told me about an app called Flash Food, and it's through Zares and No Frills and that.
Mm-hmm.
The price of food and stuff these days, I've been using it a little bit because I'm retired and I have fun playing with it. But they'll have things like catfish fillets or tilapia or different frozen fish that they have in excess and they want to get it out before it does go bad. And most of the stuff is half price. So perch fillets at $14 or $7 for the pack. Pork chops would be $10, they sell them for $5. So price-wise, it's very good. The other neat thing is they'll have boxes of fruit and vegetables, and they're either $4 or $5. And what I find, if I'm gonna go to the store and buy celery and green onions, that's $5. Well, in that bag, there'll be 15 apples and 10 oranges and an eggplant, like pretty incredible deal. So I'm buying a lot more of the fruit and vegetables than the other stuff. But I just wanted to tell people, just go to your app if you have a phone that you can put in flash food. It lists all the stores, and it's pretty fascinating. So in that, my question is, so what do you think about like the frozen fish and stuff that, it's good by the 1st of May or good by the 15th of May? Like, is there any risk in getting stuff that like that?
Good question. This is where it comes to the the smell, taste, texture, senses. So I like to err on the side of caution of like, if any one of those things looks or doesn't smell or doesn't taste correct, I'm going to trust my body's judgment and not go forward with that. Because I think that's all we really can do when it comes to food, because each individual food item is going to deteriorate at its own pace. I am a huge fan of reduced sales. I love scoping out, even in the store, like those 50% off racks and things like that. I also love anything that allows you to peek behind the scenes of the money-making industry that is the grocery stores. So I know that's kind of an evasive question. It's like, I don't think that there is one way or the other, that like those frozen foods are not bad. Those best before dates are not written in stone. It's always using your best judgment. And even like, for example, in the store, you can smell it, you can look at the color, you can ask questions of the staff, things like that. And your comment actually did remind me as well. I'm very lucky. One of my team members is in kind of the top rankings of the Longos family, actually in Guelph. And she ran a workshop on us the other day. And one of her biggest takeaways is, which I'll say to all of you, is the name brands versus the store brands are made in the same factories. So as far as when you're thinking, again, what's the biggest bang for my buck? If I'm looking for the higher quality of food, just because it's a brand name item doesn't mean that necessarily correlates to being of better quality. So keep that in mind. That's where a lot of times the store brand will be the exact same product, just in a different packaging. And how you'll be able to see that is, again, looking at those nutrition facts.
I was chatting with the one lady at the Zare store that does the flash food stuff, and she gave me a little tidbit. They're doing inventory coming up, so most of their fruits and vegetables, they're trying to reduce in quantity, so when they do their inventory, they don't have so much to count. So right now, there's a ton of potatoes and apples and onions, all sorts of stuff at half price that they're trying to get rid of, so it helps the inventory, which I wondered why there was so much stuff online all of a sudden. I bought a bag of seed potatoes, or red potatoes, but I'm going to use for seed potatoes, 15 pounds for $3.25. So, I'm going to grab stuff like that. Anyway, thanks.
Yeah. And it's great to share these tidbits. Like, it's great to have just open conversations of like, okay, how can we, and work together as a community, right? Like, I have done strategies on making food less expensive. Like, in Guelph, you have a ton of CSA box options, community supported agriculture, which are basically like kind of like what you described, is like a cheap box of locally grown, often organic food that I used to split with my best friend and her husband because it was like too much food for me at the time. I was a single woman and I was like, I can't eat all of this, but I was like, okay, let's pair together. You get half each week and I'll get some each week, and we split the cost, and it was a great way to save money. So there's lots of creative ways to not stress yourself out and get access to really high quality food that hopefully makes your body feel good.
And then there's our harvest table outside the church where you can put your extras you buy on the table, and the neighbors can pick them up, and we take them to the local food kitchen.
Yes. Yeah. And I know also in Guelph, the one thing I don't live in Guelph anymore, unfortunately. The one thing I miss the most about Guelph, if you are not part of the Guelph trading group, join the Guelph trading group. It was people who were like, I used to keep my cupboard stocked from that trading group. It was excellent. Highly recommend. Are there any other questions at all?
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Amazing presentation. Lisa's just trying to figure the tech out here. So how to get you on and our slides at the same time. But no, I'm really grateful. I see lots of folks nodding their heads and grateful for what you offered. And we thank you for being with us, and thank you for letting us test out the tech. Because you didn't have to do the drive, and we got to enjoy your company. And we are going to go and eat some treats, so we apologize that you won't get to enjoy those. But
That's okay. Enjoy them on my behalf. And it is a process. So if anybody has any questions, if you want to reach out, I love having these conversations and sharing resources. So thank you so much for having me once again.
And yeah.